This is the part of the evening where time is beginning to run out, so I am going to go ahead and start lasering some questions out there. I know there are some topics that we are all very interested in. Don't worry, we got this. Let us talk about those phone calls.
Yes.
Is the audience familiar with the phone calls?
Yes.
Anita, could you introduce the phone calls? What kind of happened with that?
Yes. So some of the evidence that the prosecution introduced in the trial included Stephen Avery's, I think was it cell phone records, where he made 2 or 3 calls to Teresa Hallback on the day that she went missing, but he blocked his number. And the suggestion by the prosecution, obviously, was that Stephen Avery was trying to lure her to, the property. And that's something that I didn't really hear the defense rebut on the documentary. So is that something you can talk to us about? How do you rebut that? What does that show?
The phone calls themselves, I think, weren't included in the documentary.
Okay, so I read about
it. The lead prosecutor in the case, after this film has come out, has kind of in a number of places in the media has, put out what I would call a bill of omissions. Here's the evidence that was omitted and shouldn't have been omitted from the documentary. And I guess one thing to know about that is, well, of course, things were omitted. The
200 hours of trial. I don't know how you can fit that into any documentary.
But one thing to understand is that there are omissions from the bill of omissions,
Right.
and what I think Ken is working off in describing what's omitted generally is the police reports that he had. So as to those phone calls, there actually was testimony at trial that explained those and or put them in further context. So Stephen Avery on his cell phone made 2 star 67 calls to Teresa Hallback, and the police reports argued that must show he was hiding his identity. She didn't know where she was going. It was an ambush. The problem with that was her 2 co-workers who did testify at trial. 2 women from Auto Traders magazine.
That's right. Yes.
Who said that she called them that afternoon and said, "I'm going to the Avery Brothers on Avery Road," and knew where she was going, not worried about it. That's where she was going, and they said she sounded fine about that. Look, to me, that's. I don't know why. I don't know why the filmmakers included this and not that. I mean, those are just editorial decisions. But I at least understand that because that evidence falls into the category where it takes a lot of
Explanation.
sort of context to understand what meaning, if any, that has.
And you talk about Ken Kratz, the prosecutor in this case, and he's going all over the media now talking about how the documentary was so one-sided. It just explained the defense narrative of what happened, and they didn't present the evidence that was favorable to the prosecution. We've heard a lot about this, and obviously they had an opportunity to participate in the documentary. They declined to do so. And another item that he's going on the news shows talking about in terms of the evidence that wasn't shown on the documentary is this purported sweat DNA belonging to Stephen Avery that was found under the hood of Teresa Hallback's car. Now, I guess I would like to know, is there such a thing as sweat DNA? Because I've never heard of sweat DNA in my career.
100 people in this room can answer that question. Sweat in and of itself doesn't have our DNA. Sweat may well have sloughed off epithelial cells and the cells
So coming from something else.
Well, from our skin cells may be sloughed off in sweat, and so you may get DNA that way. The sweat argument was an argument Mr. Kratz made repeatedly in the trial. The difficulty was, there was no evidence of sweat. Nobody identified sweat. In fact, they didn't look for blood or anything. All they knew was they got Stephen Avery's DNA from the hood latch area on Teresa's car. There again, the actual evidence at trial, as opposed to the argument about sweat or police reports, at least provided some additional interesting context for that. Obviously, in its native state, a car hood wouldn't have Stephen Avery's DNA or anybody's DNA. It's a piece of metal. So somehow DNA was transferred to that. That transfer could have happened by Stephen Avery touching the hood and leaving skin cells there. It also could have happened, the transfer could have happened with something, any other surface that had Stephen Avery's DNA on it, then being rubbed against or brought into contact with the hood. And I don't know how it happened. I have no idea how his DNA got on there. Maybe it was he who touched the thing, the car latch. What I do know is that a Division of Criminal Investigation agent testified at trial that he was in the car, in the interior of the car, swabbing, and we know Stephen Avery's blood was in the car, was swabbing, and then wanted to check the odometer, but the car wouldn't turn on.
Okay.
So he got out of the car, and he didn't change his latex gloves, and he went and popped the hood himself to reconnect or to see if the battery cables were disconnected.
Interesting.
And so, look, I have no idea whether his latex gloves resulted in the transfer of Stephen's DNA. I have no idea. If they did, it was inadvertent. I mean,
So the suggestion isn't they planted some DNA?
No. If it happened that way,
Right.
that's inadvertent. That's just a mistake of forgetting to change your gloves in the moment.
Spun in the prosecution's favor, I guess.
Speaking of the car for a second, quick thing. How did the prosecution overcome the point that he left the car there? I mean, he's a smart guy. He's been to prison. Why would he leave the car there if he did this? How did the prosecution, I'm sure you brought that up in closing, how did the prosecution address that huge reasonable doubt?
Well, that was all just a matter of argument, and our point was, look, to get the car there, you would have had to drive it past the crusher, okay? Right past the car crusher that was on the property. Maybe if you're trying to get rid of the car, crushing it rather than putting some branches over it. But that's all. Just all a matter of argument. And as I say, this is a murky case.
Right, why would he leave the blood in the car but clean it all up in the garage? If you're cleaning up, you're cleaning up. How did the prosecution overcome that reasonable doubt?
Well, I wasn't a juror, and I do want to second Gary at some level here. I mean, none of us in this room were jurors, and I'm the only one here who saw the whole trial. And I don't know that you can rely on me. I'm an advocate for everything, and it's 9 years ago. But at some level, I don't know that we ought to be serving as second-string jurors on this. Certainly not on the basis of a film, or any other fragmentary piece of information. It's natural to want to do it. I mean, the questions are fascinating, but the prosecution's argument about the car was pretty straightforward. Drove it off to the back of the lot, tried to conceal it by putting tree branches.
But what about
over it.
cleaning up the blood in the house but not in the car? Did they address that?
In our trial,
Yeah.
in the Avery trial, which went first, and it was about 6 weeks of evidence, and then there was, 2 or 3 weeks or something between the end of the Avery trial and the beginning of the Dassey trial. In our trial, the prosecution walked away completely from the theory that was presented in the March 2, 2006 press conference.
Oh my gosh.
So there was no claim of a rape or being manacled to the bed or stabbing or throat slashing or anything happening in Stephen Avery's trailer. At our trial, the theory was, well, who knows where she was killed? Maybe in the garage. And so that, that's how the lack of trace evidence in the trailer, became consigned to unimportance
Right.
in the prosecution case in the Avery trial. You guys are a death penalty state, and, for CLE purposes, think about whether courts are getting the question of inconsistent prosecution theories right, and to what extent it's proper to allow irreconcilable theories when you're prosecuting defendant A in one case and defendant B in the next for the same crime, in a severed
That was one
trial.
of the things that bothered me so much, and I wanted to ask you about that, if I just may ask you. So
By all means.
the prosecutor argues adamantly in Stephen Avery's trial, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, there is only one man responsible for this crime, and one man only, and that is Stephen Avery. And then we see him prosecuting Brendan Dassey. Is that even ethical? I've never seen that done before either.
That was closing argument. I personally, that's closing argument. I don't know. Is that ethical? It's on a line probably, I suppose. But in the heat of the moment, I get it. I personally am more troubled, for whatever it's worth, by, arguing in the Avery trial, trailer home, who cares about the trailer home,
Right.
Nothing happened there. Maybe she was shot in the garage.
Right.
And then 3 weeks later in the Dassey case, going back to the, she's handcuffed to the bed, spread eagled, raped, throat slashed, abdomen stabbed, all this horrific story that was played out in the press conference. Those are irreconcilable theories, factually. That's not irreconcilable argument. Those are irreconcilable factual
It's more troubling.
theories. And you couldn't have done it in a joint trial, right? You would have had to pick which horse to ride.
Let me, if I can, just for the sake of time, because I just want to touch it. I know there's topics the audience is particularly interested in. And Anita, I know you were particularly interested in this item, the key. That bothered me.
Minor
The
detail.
Did that bother
infamous
anyone
key.
else?
Yes, it
Yeah,
bothered
that
a lot
bothered
of
me.
people.
Okay, Anita, please
Yes.
take it away.
So the infamous key. So we know that the police investigators went and sweeped Stephen Avery's home 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, never found this key. Suddenly, I believe it was the 6th or 7th time when one of the police investigators, who by the way was supposed to have been recused from this investigation, walks in and happens to find the key to Teresa Hallback's vehicle in plain view in Stephen Avery's home. And not only did he find this key there, but surprisingly, that key only contained the DNA belonging to Stephen Avery. There was not an iota of DNA belonging to Teresa Hallback, yet this was the key to her vehicle. I mean, if we're talking about, this is an MCLE class or whatever you want to call it, when you talk about reasonable doubt, Dean, how in the world is that not built-in reasonable doubt right there for the jury? I mean, it's just, do you guys relate to my anger when it comes to this? This police investigator wasn't even supposed to be in the home.
Or how did the prosecution address that in their argument? How did they deal with that?
That's something I will talk about. I'm paraphrasing here, and I want to be very clear about that. I'm paraphrasing, and I hope I'm not doing an injustice. But as I understood the prosecution's closing argument about the key, it was, well, so what if that was planted? That's not our only evidence. And,
It was in his closing, yes. He said
I
that in his
mean,
closing.
and he wasn't conceding that it was planted, but he said, for the sake of argument, okay, what if it was planted? So what? We have a lot of other evidence, and, so forth and so on. And I know at the time, I remember what I thought of at the time, and it's still my reaction, which is that where we are? Is that really where we are? That police planting of evidence, if it occurred, is a so what? Because maybe he's guilty anyway?
Yeah. That's not how our system's supposed to work. I remember I watched the closing, and I heard him say that. He said, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, even if you believe the police planted evidence, we have other evidence that shows he's guilty. And again, once again, in my mind, I'm thinking, that's built-in reasonable doubt, regardless of if you believe he's guilty or innocent. I believe if those jurors followed the instructions that they were given by the judge, he should have been acquitted. I think even just based on that statement.
But again, there were 200 hours of evidence.
Right.
The jurors heard all of that.
Well, let's talk about the jurors, though.
And we haven't.
Let's talk about the jurors,
so-
though. So we have Ken Kratz giving a press conference a couple of hours after the alleged confession comes out, and he's laying out for the entire world, AKA the jury pool, what he believes happened in this case, right? And these are the same jurors that are supposed to be deciding on the guilt or innocence of Stephen in this case. What do you make of that? Do you think he got a fair trial?
I think it would have been very hard to get a fair trial anywhere in Wisconsin after that press conference, personally. And it wasn't, and when I say anywhere in Wisconsin, in my view and Jerry's at the time, it made a change of venue bootless, in that there are 7 media markets in Wisconsin. All 7 of them carried that live, and then it reverberated for 10 months with excerpts being replayed and the narrative. I mean, that was you don't see that whole press conference in the film, but it was a compelling, horrific, gripping narrative of a crime that turned out to be essentially disproven by the factual evidence, by the trace evidence. But there it was.
Dean,
10 months before the trial.
Again, for the sake of time, let me just move us on to another topic, which I guarantee you'll get some reaction out of the audience. And if you don't, that'll really embarrass me, so please react. The blood vial. The blood vial that was in custody had a puncture, and the box, which was supposed to be sealed, if I'm not mistaken, was open. Please, tell us your thoughts.
So don't make too much about the puncture, and we didn't. The puncture is unsurprising. A phlebotomist might well puncture the cap on the vial to put the blood into the vial initially. What was of more concern, and people actually have picked up on this from the movie, and we argued at the time, was there's now blood between the glass and the seal, the cap. That's going to come by extracting blood from the vial, not by injecting it into the vial. You can create a vacuum as you're extracting, and you may get blood up under the cap. That was the more important aspect of the whole. The box being slit, nobody could nail that down. That was one of these murky things because nobody knew whether it had been resealed after return from the 1994 DNA testing that the defense did. That, as I recall, that just was sort of a draw.
Wasn't the whole point of that puncture point was that lab would not use needles? Wasn't that in the show that they only would open there was no reason for it to be punctured because that's not how the lab operated. That's what I took away from that scene. Did I not read that right? And that's why it was a big deal.
The testing lab, correct, but the phlebotomist who drew the blood and put it in the vial initially.
Oh, initially. I don't remember that making
may
it
well
series,
have punctured,
to put back in.
Punctured the cap.
But that would have taken away from the aha moment in the show. So makes sense why that wasn't there.
That's true.
Right?
Let me direct the question here. With regards to the witness testimony, and as we all discussed a moment ago, one of the witnesses had a relatively low IQ, so on and so forth. And I'll open this up. Lou, if you want to give a quick something, and then over to Dean. How do you overcome stuff like that? On the criminal defense side, you are defending a guy, and there is testimony coming at him from someone with an IQ of 70 who, as Gary pointed out, some of the interrogation may have been coerced. How do you handle that?
Right. It makes for an impassioned closing argument where we argue that the law is not meant to punish people that have developmental disabilities. It's meant to punish people that do something wrong. So let's not apply it for the reasons that it wasn't supposed to be applied. That's the summary of it. But I'll let Dean take it.
I can't improve on that.
All right.
Well, was he
Next
ever
question.
evaluated? Because that wasn't part of the documentary. Was Brendan ever evaluated by a medical professional to determine A, competency, and B, whether or not he understood what was going on?
If there was a competency evaluation done by the DASI team, I'm not aware of it.
Okay.
Jerry and I retained a psychologist who's an expert in suggestibility and, coercive interrogation techniques. We did that because we anticipated that there might be a plea in the DASI case, and then that he would become a state witness in the Avery case. And so we were prepared with an expert to address that. That expert, who was really quite good, he's and has done a lot of work in this area. He's at Beloit College, which is in southern Wisconsin. He was available to testify in the DASI case. He was not called by the defense, and I don't know why.
I almost feel like, in a way, Brendan was used as a state's witness when, I don't know if you all recall from the documentary, Brendan Dassey's defense attorney, who essentially threw him under the bus. When you see how he conducted himself, he essentially went on the record to the media and said, my client's guilty. He then sends him to his own private investigator, and that was also one of the most coerced confessions I've ever seen, at the behest of his own defense attorney. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I'm just wondering your personal opinion about that. Was this attorney just grossly negligent? Was this just malpractice? Or was there some collusion going on?
Let's just take into consideration this is being streamed live on YouTube.
That's okay. He was investigated. It's my understanding he was investigated. Was he not? Brendan Dassey's attorney?
The public defender, I think you're referring to. His original attorney?
The original
I forgot his
attorney.
name.
He didn't show up at the police interrogations. He sent him to the
Well,
PI who...
no, I mean, I don't think there was an investigation. There was a pretrial motion addressing that, and then ultimately the judge relieved him. I personally do not think there was collusion in the sense you're using the term going on there. And, beyond that, I'm uncomfortable talking very much about that because I only know essentially what we all saw in the film about that. I really don't know much more about that. I had never seen the defense investigator's interview until this film. That was not part of the Avery discovery. And, I think I'll leave it at that as to specifics. I do think this is a moment for, at least in Wisconsin, for us to think about pretrial publicity and the role of lawyers in pretrial publicity. Not just the prosecution side, but the defense side in that instance.
Dean, let me ask you a question.
Just for a change?
Yeah. Do you think there's going to be, and to be honest with you, I watched documentaries and I thought, oh, this is going to change everything. People are going to stop looking at things the way they look, and it never quite happened. Do you think this documentary, which has gone, if nothing else, the audience here is indicative, absolutely viral, do you think this is going to make a difference in the way the criminal justice system works?
Well, no one film, no one talk, no one trial is going to change much. But in combination with the sort of discussion we're having here tonight, in combination with other thoughtful, pieces of whatever point of view on the criminal justice system, I hope so. There is an opportunity here to have a broader discussion about some of the issues we've addressed tonight. And I do think, especially as lawyers, in the end, whatever energy or motivation or focus we can draw from this film or Serial, or what the Jinx or what have you, whatever motivation we might draw from that, every one of you is going to a courthouse here tomorrow. And those of you who practice criminal law tomorrow are going to be dealing with 1, 2, 3, 30, whatever, of the 20 million Americans who are charged with a crime every year in this country. And that seems to me what our focus really needs to be in the end. If we've learned something from this, or if we've got, if we're passionate about concerns that are raised, we have a place as lawyers to express those. And we can be talking to our friends who aren't lawyers about someday, really old school, the Postal Service may bring you a jury summons in a mailbox. And you're going to open that jury summons, and you may have to go down and serve on a jury. And maybe this is a moment to think about that as an opportunity and how we undertake that civic duty.